Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. As the COVID-19 pandemic shut down schools and colleges and disrupted learning, most of the schools and colleges they started shifting towards online education or digital education. But this sudden shift to online learning raised a number of concerns, such as the issues of accessibility, the health impact on students due to their prolonged exposure to the screens of laptops, smartphones, etc. So in order to address these concerns and establish a set of standard guidelines for digital education, the Ministry of Human Resource and Development has come out with the Pragyata Guidelines for digital education. These guidelines have been formulated by the NCERT and they are only advisory in nature, and the schools and colleges are encouraged to abide by them. But since education and online learning falls under the domain of the state government, the states have been given the flexibility to customize the guidelines and build upon the guidelines prescribed by NCERT based upon local needs and local demands. See, for accessing digital education, there are two key resources that a student requires. One is a communication device such as a laptop, a desktop computer, or a smartphone, and second is a high-speed internet connection. But every student may not have access to these resources, thus creating unequal access to education. Ever since the pandemic broke out, and ever since schools shifted to the online domain, experts have pointed out that unequal access to technology among students will promote inequality in education. This major concern has been taken into account by the NCERT and the MHRD, and the issue of unequal access to technology has been factored into the Pragyata Guidelines. This concern has been given the highest priority under the Pragyata Guidelines, and it recognizes that within the same class, students might have different levels of access to technology. For example, a few students might have access to computers and smartphones along with 4G internet connections. And a few students might have access to these devices, but their access to internet might be limited. Whereas a few other students might have access to just a television with a cable or DTH connection, or they might have access to just a radio or a basic phone connection. And we cannot ignore the fact that a few students may not have any kind of access to any communication devices, and they might be completely cut off from the internet. So this unequal access to technology among students of the same class is a result of the economic status of the students' families and a result of their remote location. But these factors should never be allowed to become a hindrance to learning, and it should never be allowed to create inequalities in education. So the Pragyata Guidelines takes these factors into account, and it recommends that every school should conduct a survey to determine the kind of digital infrastructure that can be accessed by its students and teachers, and then decide upon the mode of teaching based on this survey. The Pragyata Guidelines points out that schools should not assume that synchronous communication is the only available mode of teaching. What is synchronous communication? It is nothing but face-to-face learning through online platforms such as Zoom, WebEx, etc. The guidelines clearly point out that synchronous communication is not the only mode that is available to teach students, because in case of synchronous communication, both the students and the teachers, they need to have access to the right communication device with access to high-speed internet. The Pragyata Guidelines recommends that schools will have to adopt a mix of synchronous communication along with asynchronous learning, and they will have to decide upon the right mode of teaching based upon the survey of the digital infrastructure that can be accessed by its students and teachers. Asynchronous learning includes the availability of recorded videos that can be readily downloaded and watched according to the convenience of the student. It also includes radio shows and TV programs, which does not require any access to expensive devices and high-speed internet. It also includes the promotion of self-learning activities, carrying out creative projects and creative assignments, and such activity-based learning can be promoted by schools by sending out timely messages via text-based messaging or instant messaging apps. So overall, a mix of synchronous learning and asynchronous learning will help in reducing the impact of unequal access to technology. Then, in order to address the health impact of prolonged exposure to screens on the physical and mental health of the students, the center has decided to limit the duration of online classes. For pre-primary, that is for kindergarten, nursery and preschool, the guidelines does not recommend any screen time for children, but it recommends that the teachers should spend not more than 30 minutes with the parents. So the intention is to reduce the screen time of pre-primary students and to promote parent-teacher interaction so that parents can promote self-learning at the home itself. Then for students between class 1 and class 8, the guidelines recommend not more than 2 sessions of online classes of 30 to 45 minutes each. Then for students between class 9 to class 12, the guidelines recommend not more than 4 online sessions of 30 to 45 minutes each, with adequate breaks between each session. Then apart from this, the guidelines recommend schools to stick to the NCERT's academic calendar, and it advises schools to encourage greater involvement from the parents in order to monitor the progress of their wards by sharing timely information and important resources with them through constant emails and messages sent via instant messaging apps. The guidelines is also asking the schools to take into account that teachers themselves could be parents and they would need to supervise the learning of their own children as well. So the guidelines is asking the schools to help the teachers to strike a balance between their work and personal life by providing for adequate arrangements. Apart from this, schools have also been advised to make students aware of the various threats that they might face in the cyber domain, including instances of cyberbullying. So these guidelines were very much needed, and they are expected to address the concerns that have been raised due to the sudden shift towards online learning, and it is expected to help standardize digital education. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, in which the writer helps us understand China's perspective of India. Considering that India is dealing with a major border dispute and strategic challenge with China, and now that India is seeking to reset its ties with Beijing, it's very important for us, especially the Indian government, to understand as to what the Chinese government and its strategic thinkers think about India. See, after the recent clashes between India and China at the Galwan River Valley, most strategic experts in China have felt that this incident was not an accident. According to them, it was an inevitable result of India's aggression. They have held India's long pending speculation on the border dispute and India's recent infrastructure arms race, especially along the disputed border, to be the reasons that led to these clashes. So according to them, it is justified for China to teach India a lesson for the unnecessary aggression and arms race that India has promoted at the border areas, and hence they have concluded that the Galwan clashes were an inevitable result of India's aggression. For the Indian government and for Indian strategic thinkers, this line of thinking in China should not come as an entire shock, because according to China's current perception, this happens to be the new normal in the India-China relationship. Most strategic thinkers in China have concluded that India is just another quasi-ally of the United States, which is working at the behest of the US to contain Chinese influence in the region. They believe that such conflicts between India and China would become the new normal because areas of global cooperation has diminished over the years as India grew closer to the United States, and subsequent regional competition between the two Asian powers has led to the emergence of numerous disputes. A tense and disputed relationship is going to be the new normal between India and China, and hence a large part of the thinking in China is inclined towards teaching India a lesson. In fact, this perception of India that China holds is quite similar to its perception of most of the Southeast Asian countries as well. China's strategic thinking is that most Southeast Asian powers, such as Vietnam, Philippines, etc., are either allies or quasi-allies of the United States. Similarly, they view India as a quasi-ally of the United States, and they see the ongoing tensions towards its western and eastern frontiers as a part of a larger strategic game with the United States. This assumption leads Chinese strategic thinkers to conclude that most Southeast Asian countries and India are just acting as the arms and legs of the United States in order to contain China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region, which also happens to be a top priority strategic objective for the United States. So based on these assumptions, Chinese strategic thinkers have been pushing the government to display strong determination and the will to fight against American allies such as India. Specifically with regard to the India-China border dispute, they asked the Chinese government to adopt the policy of 3 no's towards India. That is to show no weakness, give no concession, and a no to the strategy of defensive defense, which means that China should adopt an offensive strategy in order to defend its interests. This strategy of China is also in line with Mao Zedong's 5-finger policy towards Tibet. It is said that Mao Zedong used to describe Tibet as the right palm of China, and he used to refer to Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan and Arunachal Pradesh as the 5 fingers of Tibet. His strategy was to liberate these 5 fingers of Tibet even at the cost of destabilizing India. This offensive defense strategy of China and its flawed perception of India goes on to explain why China actively encourages frequent border incursions along its disputed border with India, and it also explains why China has opened up multiple disputes simultaneously, stretching all the way from Aksai Chin to Arunachal Pradesh. It also explains why China seeks to destabilize India by exploiting its internal divides, by extending support to Maoists and left-wing extremists, by extending support to Naga insurgents and several other northeast insurgent outfits, and also the indirect support given to Kashmiri separatists via Pakistan. It also goes on to explain as to why China seeks to encircle India through its strategy of so-called string of pearls, and why it continues to push ahead the controversial China-Pakistan economic corridor, despite being well aware that the route of the corridor passes through the disputed region of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So the entirety of China's India policy is based on these 3 no's. That is, not to show any weakness, not to give any concessions to India, and to adopt an offensive defense in order to defend its tactical and strategic interests. But there is also a line of thinking in China which does not encourage such open confrontation with India. This section of the strategic establishment reminds the Chinese government that the United States is the principal rival of China and not neighboring country India. They argue that by unnecessarily opening up a confrontation with India and by not recognizing the rise of India as a major power in Asia, China is committing a grave strategic mistake, because this would push India further into the arms of the United States, leading to the formation of an anti-China alliance amongst like-minded countries such as Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, etc. These critics of China's policy point out that Donald Trump's strategy of expanding the G7 into the G11 has also been designed to exclude China from international affairs. The proposed expansion of the G7 to the G11 includes India and other emerging powers that are closely aligned with the interests of the United States. So this section of the strategic experts argue that by deliberately pushing India into the arms of the United States, China is promoting its own exclusion in international affairs. So they argue that in order to prevent this outcome and in order to defeat these designs of the United States, China would have to reset its relations with India, and it would be better off if it establishes friendly relations with its neighboring countries. So understanding this perception of India by the Chinese government and by China's strategic thinkers, and understanding this policy dilemma of China is very important for the Indian government and for Indian strategic thinkers as they seek to reset India's relations with China. Now let's take up an article from page number 11. India and European Union are likely to resume negotiations over their pending free trade agreement known as the Bilateral Trade and Investment Agreement. The announcement to resume the FTA negotiations is likely to be made at the upcoming virtual summit between India and the European Union. See, these FTA negotiations were suspended way back in 2013, and it is very important to understand as to why the BTIA negotiations between India and the European Union fell apart. See, if you look at India's trading relationship with the European Union, you will find that the European Union happens to be India's largest trading partner and largest investor, that is, if you consider the European Union as one region. The EU region alone accounts for nearly 11% of India's global trade, thus making the European Union India's largest trading partner. But the trade volume of EU countries with India pales in comparison, and it just accounts for 3% of European Union's global trade. So there is definitely a lot of potential over here to further promote the trade volume between the two regions, and this can be facilitated by reducing the tariff barriers and the non-tariff barriers by working out a free trade agreement known as the Bilateral Trade and Investment Agreement. See, apart from the large-scale movement of goods and services between India and the EU, there is also a lot of people movement, especially involving Indian students and Indian professionals who seek to study and work in EU countries. Then apart from this, there is large-scale movement of investment between the two regions as well. But despite these factors, both the regions have failed to work out a free trade agreement because the previous negotiations fell apart due to three primary reasons. These reasons happen to be based on the fact that India is still a developing country, while most of the EU members are developed economies, especially the West European countries. Developed economies such as France, Germany, etc., they would expect India to adopt a strict IPR policy and maintain very high phytosanitary and hygiene standards. But a developing country like India can never afford to implement a strict IPR policy because an intellectual property regime that entirely favors the industry may not help in achieving the socio-economic goals of a developing country. Apart from this, the European countries were also unhappy with India's weak enforcement of IP laws. Then for a developing country, it would be very difficult to maintain high phytosanitary and hygiene standards, as it would directly increase the cost of Indian agricultural exports, Indian food exports, and the export of Indian drugs. This would not only increase the cost for Indian agriculture and Indian industry, but it would also make their exports less competitive. Then apart from these factors, the other reason why the FTA negotiations fell apart was because of India's insistence that the European Union should liberalize its immigration policies and the restrictions on the Schengen visa in order to facilitate greater movement of Indian students and Indian professionals towards European countries. But the disagreements between India and the European Union on these three grounds resulted in the failure of the FTA negotiations, and as a result, the trade deal had fallen apart. Now let's take up an article from page number 14, which helps us understand the geopolitics and geoeconomics surrounding the rollout of 5G technology. See, we have discussed in previous sessions that the Western world, led by the United States, have labeled China's Huawei as a major cybersecurity threat due to its proximity to the Chinese PLA and the Chinese intelligence agencies. See, Huawei is a leading global manufacturer of not just mobile phones, but also of critical telecom and switching equipment that forms the backbone of telecom networks around the world and as well as the larger internet. The dominance of Huawei in this critical domain is so significant that most of the major telecom operators and internet service providers around the world are dependent on its equipment. But Western intelligence agencies believe that these equipments that are manufactured by Huawei come pre-installed with backdoors in order to facilitate the Chinese PLA and its intelligence agencies to mount cyber attacks and carry out espionage against Western countries. So in order to restrict the involvement of Huawei in America's telecom and internet infrastructure, especially with regard to the rollout of 5G technology, the United States has placed sanctions and it has banned American telecom operators and ISPs from making use of Huawei's equipment. While the security concerns surrounding Huawei appear to be genuine to a certain extent, there is also a geopolitical and geoeconomic angle that exists to this conflict between the United States and China. This is because the rollout of 5G technology is set to further accelerate the ongoing fourth industrial revolution, and the government which has dominant control over 5G technology and equipment will get to dominate the global economy of the future. So this geoeconomic angle possibly explains the geopolitics surrounding 5G technology. After imposing such sanctions against Huawei, The United States expected its close allies, such as Britain, other West European countries, and Canada, to place similar sanctions against Huawei and boycott its telecom equipment. But such a sudden boycott of Huawei's equipment is not possible for any country because, as we discussed, its equipment forms the backbone of most countries' telecom and internet infrastructure, and hence for these countries there is a need to balance their economic concerns against the security concerns. So in January this year, the British government allowed Huawei to roll out 5G technology, but in the interest of cybersecurity, it excluded core systems, which includes government and defense networks, and it restricted the involvement of Huawei to just 35% of the overall project. So this was basically an attempt of Britain to balance the economic considerations versus the security concerns. But this decision of the British government invited a backlash from the United States. The United States called for a complete ban on Huawei's equipment, and it threatened Britain that if it goes ahead with the deal, then it would cut off its security and intelligence cooperation arrangement with Britain. See, if you remember, recently we had discussed about the 5 Eyes group. This refers to a group of 5 countries, including United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, which have established a close intelligence sharing arrangement between themselves by interlinking few critical networks of their telecom and internet infrastructure. It is because of this reason that the United States feels threatened by the involvement of Huawei in Britain's 5G network. The United States feels that this interconnection between the telecom infrastructure of Britain and US would still allow China to hack into American networks, thereby threatening the national security of the United States. So after being threatened and after being brought under diplomatic pressure by the United States, Britain has decided to reverse this policy, and it has decided to place a limited ban on Huawei's equipment. As per the new policy, British telecom operators would be required to stop buying all 5G equipment from Huawei by the end of 2020 onwards. And British telecom operators and ISPs have been notified that by 2027, all the existing 5G equipment of Huawei should be completely removed from Britain's telecom and internet infrastructure. But however, it has granted an exemption for the legacy equipment that is a part of Britain's 4G network, because any orders to remove the existing equipment of Huawei on its 4G network would have caused massive disruption to the British economy. Next, on page number 14, we have 2 more articles that I would request you to go through once. One is an article which analyzes the deep strategic inroads that China has made into Iran and the possible impact of this on India. This is a topic that we have covered in complete detail in yesterday's analysis, so you can go back and watch this analysis and go through this article once. Then on the same page, we have another article which refers to the rejection of Beijing's claims in the South China Sea by the United States. This is again a topic that we have covered multiple times in the recent past, including on the 1st of April, the 24th of April, the 27th of June, and more recently on the 8th of July. So if required, kindly go through these videos and go through the column once. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. The Kanchanjuri Animal Corridor is a major corridor used by animals, especially to escape floods. It can be found in which protected area? The correct answer is option B. It can be found in the Kaziranga National Park. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 1 that makes a reference to the Kanchanjuri Animal Corridor that is located in the Kaziranga National Park. See, we have discussed in previous sessions that the Kaziranga National Park is frequently threatened by the flood waters of the Brahmaputra and its tributaries. These seasonal floods threaten the very survival of a number of threatened species, including the one-horned rhinoceros, the tigers, elephants, etc. So in order to escape the impact of these floods, these animals make use of a migratory corridor known as the Kanchanjuri Corridor in order to move from the Kaziranga National Park and reside temporarily at the foothills of the Karbi Anglong region. Once the flood waters recede, they again return back to the Kaziranga National Park, and hence the Kanchanjuri Corridor is a very important migratory corridor. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following rivers flow from Nepal to Bihar? Kosi, Gandak, Betwa, Bagmati. The correct answer is option B, 1, 2 and 4 only. See, the Kosi, Gandak and Bagmati are Himalayan rivers that originate in Nepal and they flow towards Bihar. Whereas the Betwa flows through Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh after taking birth in the Vindhya mountain ranges, and it later merges with the Yamuna, which in turn is a tributary of the Ganga. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 5, Bihar is facing the threat of floods after the catchment areas of the Kosi river, Bagmati river and the Gandak river in Nepal received heavy rainfall. Now let's take up the next practice question. During the 1857 mutiny, Tantia Tope came to the assistance of Rani Lakshmi Bai and helped her seize which location before being defeated by the British? The correct answer is option B, Gwalior. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 5 that makes a reference to the legal dispute surrounding the construction of a national monument as a tribute to General Tantia Tope in Maharashtra. Now let's take up the next practice question. The signing of the Shillong Accord in 1975 led to the establishment of which major insurgent outfit? The correct answer is option B. The signing of the Shillong Accord laid the foundation for the establishment of the National Socialist Council of Nagaland or NSCN. See, the Naga separatist movement dates back to the pre-independence days. During the World Wars, members of the Naga Club had assisted the British government in their war efforts because the Nagas were known for their combat and jungle warfare skills. In return for this assistance provided by the Nagas, they were expecting the British government to grant them independence when they were to quit the Indian subcontinent, and they were very clear that they did not have any wish to merge with the Indian Union. But the British failed to fulfill this promise, and as India became independent in 1947, various Naga groups declared independence and they offered resistance by organizing themselves under the Naga National Council. So this is how the first separatist insurgent war began in India. Then after years of conflict with Indian security forces, finally the government of India negotiated a peace accord with the Naga National Council, and this accord was known as the Shillong Accord, which was signed in 1975. This accord was supposed to bring insurgency and separatism in the Naga inhabited areas to an end in return for limited autonomy within the Indian constitution. But key leaders of the NNC such as Isaac, Moiwa and Kaplang were unhappy with the terms of the Shillong Accord, and hence they abandoned their commitments under the Shillong Accord and they went on to establish the NSCN in 1980, which would later emerge as one of the most notorious insurgent outfits of India. Later, due to ideological differences between the leaders, the NSCN split into NSCN-IM and NSCN-K factions. But due to the weakening of the NSCN Isaac Moiwa faction by Indian security forces and intelligence agencies, this faction of NSCN agreed to sign a ceasefire agreement with the government of India in 1997. But even after signing the ceasefire agreement, it continued with its insurgent activities, but the group has been substantially weakened over the years. In fact, now the NSCN-IM is a part of the ongoing negotiations under the Naga Peace Accord, which was signed in 2015. But the other faction of NSCN, that is NSCN Kaplang, is currently based out of Myanmar, and it still happens to be in a state of war against India. That's the reason why the NSCN Kaplang faction has been designated as a terrorist outfit under India's Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. By using Myanmar as a base, the NSCN Kaplang faction continues to wage its insurgent war against India with the objective of establishing the so-called Nagalim or Greater Nagaland, which seeks to unite all the Naga inhabited areas not just in India but also in Myanmar. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the NSCN-IM faction has warned the government of India of ugly consequences if the government fails to clarify on the validity and extent of the ceasefire agreement of 1997. This warning has come out from the NSCN-IM faction because recently a few members of NSCN-IM have been killed by Assam Rifles during counter-insurgency operations that were being conducted in the region. Now let's take up the next practice question. The right of transgender people to declare their self-perceived gender identity was recognized by the Supreme Court in which case? The correct answer is option B, NALSA case. See, all the cases that have been mentioned over here are historic landmark cases. So I want you to read about these cases and understand their significance and post them in the comment section below. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the government has notified the draft rules under the controversial Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act of 2019. See, this legislation, which seeks to protect the rights of transgender persons, has been criticized by the transgender community and as well as by activists because it is not in line with the NALSA judgment of the Supreme Court. Because in the NALSA case, the Supreme Court had said that a transgender person has the right to self-determine or self-identify his gender identity. The Supreme Court has said there was no need for any medical intervention or medical examination. But the law passed by the Parliament in 2019 went against this judgment of the Supreme Court, and it mandated a medical test in order to obtain a transgender ID certificate for availing the benefits of this legislation. But after facing a lot of opposition and criticism, the government has decided to drop this requirement of a medical test under the draft rules. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following are correctly matched? On this side we have weapon systems, and on the other we have the country of origin. First we have Spike long-range anti-tank guided missiles matched with Israel, 6-or assault rifles matched with Germany and United States, the S-400 Triumph matched with Russia. All the three are correct. Option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the Indian Army is set to place a repeat order for the Spike long-range anti-tank guided missiles from Israel, along with the repeat order that the Army has placed for 6-or assault rifles from the United States. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. On which of the following can you find the Bureau of Energy Efficiency star label? Ceiling fans, electric geysers, tubular fluorescent lamps. All the three are correct. Option D is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, Pragyata Guidelines for Digital Education factor in unequal access to technology. Discuss. The second question, as New Delhi seeks to reset ties with Beijing, it must take note of the ongoing Chinese debate on India. Evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.